What if I told you that the Woody you know and love was supposed to be a sarcastic jerk that everyone hated? Or that Buzz Lightyear was originally conceived as a villain? What if Dory was male? And what if the entire cast of Inside Out had completely different personalities? The Pixar films we cherish today, the ones that made us laugh, cry, and question our entire existence, almost looked very different. And today we're talking about the Pixar archives to uncover the shocking original versions of your favorite characters. Let's start with the one that almost destroyed Pixar before it even began. Woody. From villain to hero. You know Woody as the loyal, if somewhat jealous cowboy doll who ultimately learns to share Andy's love with other toys. But what if I told you the original Woody was so unlikable that he almost killed Toy Story? And Pixar itself. In the early versions of Toy Story, Woody wasn't just jealous of Buzz, he was downright cruel. We're talking about a cynical, sarcastic, bossy character who ordered the other toys around like a tyrant. Can you imagine? The movie that would launch Pixar into the stratosphere almost never happened because Woody was too much of a jerk. But why was Woody written this way in the first place? Well, Disney had been pushing Pixar to make the film more edgy and adult. They wanted sass, attitude, and conflict. So Pixar complied, but they took it way too far. The result was a Woody who made Lotso from Toy Story 3 look like a teddy bear. In one infamous scene from the original script, Woody actually threw Slinky out of the moving truck, told RC to drive off a cliff, and showed zero remorse for his actions. The other toys didn't just dislike Woody, they were terrified of him. The Pixar team worked around the clock to completely reinvent Woody's character. They stripped away the meanness and replaced it with vulnerability. They kept the jealousy, but added layers of insecurity and fear of abandonment. The transformation worked. Woody became a character audiences could root for. Flawed, yes, but fundamentally good-hearted. And Toy Story became the first fully computer-animated feature film and a massive critical and commercial success. But here's a question. What if Buzz Lightyear was actually the villain of Toy Story? In one of the earliest concepts for Toy Story, Buzz wasn't a delusional space hero. He was a self-aware toy who knew exactly what he was and used his popularity to manipulate the other toys. Think of it as Toy Story meets House of Cards. This version of Buzz was calculating and power-hungry. Can you imagine how different the emotional arc of Toy Story would have been? The beautiful moment when Buzz realizes he's a toy and goes through an existential crisis. That wouldn't exist. The friendship between Woody and Buzz, built on completely different foundations. The villain version of Buzz would have made Toy Story darker, more cynical, and ultimately less emotionally resonant. Sometimes the best creative decision is knowing what not to do. Dory. When Finding Nemo almost had a male co-lead. Here's something that might shock you. Dory was originally written as a male character. That's right. The forgetful, optimistic fish who stole our hearts in Finding Nemo was initially going to be a guy. The character was even going to be voiced by William H. Macy, not Ellen DeGeneres. But why the change? Director Andrew Stanton has said that when Ellen DeGeneres came in to audition, she brought something to the character that the male version was missing, a genuine warmth and vulnerability that made Dory's forgetfulness feel less like a punchline and more like a real condition that she was bravely coping with. Think about it. If Dory had been male, would the character have had the same emotional impact? And would we have gotten the beautiful story of Finding Dory where she searches for her parents? The gender swap was a game changer. And let's be honest, Just Keep Swimming hits different coming from Ellen's Dory than it would have from the original male version. This change also made the film more balanced. Instead of being a buddy comedy about two male fish, it became a story about found family with a more diverse dynamic. Inside Out. When all the emotions were different, ready to have your mind blown. The emotions in Inside Out, joy, sadness, fear, anger, and disgust, almost had completely different roles and personalities. In early versions of Inside Out, there were 27 emotions. 27. Can you imagine? The film would have been a chaotic mess, but even when they narrowed it down to 5, the emotions themselves were almost unrecognizable from what we got. Originally, Joy wasn't the bubbly, optimistic leader we know. She was actually going to be more manic and over the top, almost desperate in her attempts to keep Riley happy. The character was so intense that test audiences found her exhausting rather than endearing. But the biggest change? Sadness was originally going to be lazy, not sad. That's right, the emotion we know as sadness was conceptualized as a lethargic, unmotivated emotion that just wanted to lie around. Think about how that would have changed the entire message of the film. The beautiful revelation that sadness has value and serves an important purpose in our emotional lives? That wouldn't exist if sadness was just lazy and apathetic. Fear was almost designed to be much more paranoid and conspiracy-minded, constantly seeing threats that didn't exist. Anger was going to be more violent and destructive, and disgust? She was almost a completely different emotion, originally conceived as envy. Director Pete Docter has talked about how the team struggled for years to get the emotions right. They even considered having love as one of the 5 core emotions, but couldn't figure out how to make it work without overlapping with joy. The breakthrough came when they started thinking about the emotions not as personality traits, but as essential psychological functions. Fear keeps us safe. Disgust keeps us from being poisoned. Anger motivates us to fight injustice. And most importantly, sadness connects us to others and signals when we need help. That realization transformed Inside Out from a simple kids' movie about emotions into a profound meditation on mental health and emotional intelligence. But it almost didn't happen because the original emotion concepts were so far off base. The entire franchise would have been completely different. Sometimes the best creative decision is to make your characters likable, even if it's less edgy or realistic. Remy. From side character to star, here's one that might surprise you. Remy, the culinary genius rat from Ratatouille, wasn't originally the main character of his own movie. In early versions of Ratatouille, the story focused primarily on Linguini, the clumsy human kitchen worker. Remy was just going to be a sidekick, a magical talking rat who helped Linguini cook, but didn't have much of his own story or agency. But director Brad Bird saw something special in Remy. He realized that the rat had a much more interesting story than the human. Here you had a creature who was supposed to be a pest, who was despised in kitchens, but who had this incredible passion and talent for cooking. That's a metaphor for anyone who's ever felt like they don't belong, or that society has written them off. So Bird made Remy the protagonist. He gave the rat dreams, ambitions, conflicts, and a complete character arc. Linguini became the supporting character, important, but not the emotional center of the story. This change elevated Ratatouille from a simple talking animal helps human story into a profound meditation on artistry, criticism, and what it means to follow your passion against all odds. The iconic moment when Anton Ego tastes Remy's ratatouille and is transported back to his childhood? That only works because we've spent the entire film invested in Remy's journey as an artist. If Remy had remained a sidekick, we wouldn't have gotten one of Pixar's most mature and sophisticated films. We wouldn't have gotten the beautiful speech about how not everyone can be a great artist, but a great artist can come from anywhere. The entire message of the film hinges on Remy being the star. Ellie, the character who almost never existed. Ellie, the beloved wife from the opening of Up, almost didn't exist at all. In the earliest versions of Up, Carl was going to be alone from the beginning. He was a grumpy old man who had always been alone, and the film was going to be about him finally learning to connect with others through his adventure with Russell. But something was missing. The writers couldn't figure out why Carl was so grumpy and resistant to change. They needed a reason, an emotional foundation for his character. That's when they came up with Ellie. And more specifically, that's when they came up with the married life sequence, the wordless montage showing Carl and Ellie's entire relationship from courtship to old age. But even once Ellie was added to the script, the character almost looked completely different. In some early designs, Ellie was going to be much older when she met Carl, already an adult rather than a childhood friend. In others, she was more reserved and quiet, not the boisterous adventurer we came to love. The breakthrough came when they decided to make Ellie as vibrant and adventurous as possible, a contrast to Carl's more cautious nature. Her energy and enthusiasm needed to be infectious enough that we understood why Carl fell in love with her, and why her loss devastated him so completely. Think about how different Up would be without Ellie, or with a different version of Ellie. The emotional weight of the entire film rests on those first 10 minutes. We need to fall in love with Ellie too, so we understand Carl's grief and his journey to honor her memory. If Ellie had been less vivid, less alive, the whole film would have fallen flat. Sometimes the most important character is the one who's barely in the movie. Wall-E. When the robot could talk. Here's one that would have fundamentally changed one of Pixar's most ambitious films. Wall-E was originally going to be able to speak normally. That's right. The little robot who communicates through beeps, gestures, and the occasional "Eva" was going to have full dialogue. Early scripts had Wall-E narrating his thoughts, explaining his loneliness, and having conversations with himself. But director Andrew Stanton made a bold choice: strip away the dialogue. He wanted to tell Wall-E's story almost entirely through visual storytelling, creating what he called a science fiction film made by Buster Keaton. Think about how radical that decision was. This was a major animated film from a major studio, and they were going to have the first 40 minutes be almost entirely dialogue-free. Studio executives were terrified. How would they market it? How would kids stay engaged? How would audiences understand what was happening? But Stanton insisted, and he was right. The lack of dialogue made Wall-E more universal and more emotionally powerful. We didn't need Wall-E to tell us he was lonely. We could see it in every aspect of his existence. We didn't need him to explain his love for Eve. We could feel it in every beep and gesture. If Wall-E had been able to talk normally, the film would have been more conventional, less daring, and ultimately less memorable. The silence made us pay attention differently. It made us more emotionally engaged, and it proved that Pixar could tell profound stories without relying on clever dialogue. Merida, the princess who almost had a prince. Here's one that saved Brave from being just another princess movie. Merida was originally going to have a love interest. In early drafts of Brave, the story was going to end with Merida falling in love with one of the suitor's sons. After learning her lesson about respecting her mother and tradition, she was going to choose love on her own terms, but still end up with a prince. But director Brenda Chapman pushed back hard against this. She wanted Brave to be a story about a mother and daughter. Period. No romance required, no prince necessary. This was a radical departure for a Disney princess movie. Yes, Brave is technically part of the Disney princess franchise even though it's Pixar. Every previous princess had gotten a prince, or at least a love interest, but Merida wasn't interested in any of that. Her story was about autonomy, about family, and about understanding her mother. It would have suggested that even independent, strong-willed women still need romance to complete their story. Instead, Brave said something different. A young woman's most important relationship might be with her mother. Bong, the character who changed everything. Let's talk about one of the most emotionally devastating characters in all of Pixar, Bong from Inside Out. But did you know he almost didn't exist? And when he did exist, he was completely different. In early versions of Inside Out, there was no Bong. Riley's imaginary friend was going to be a subplot involving a real friend from Minnesota that she missed. But that version felt too grounded, too realistic for a film taking place inside someone's mind. When they decided to create an imaginary friend character, the first versions of Bong were much more sinister. He was going to be a forgotten memory who had turned bitter and angry, potentially even antagonistic toward joy and sadness. Imagine if Bong had been a villain, a personification of forgotten childhood innocence that had curdled into resentment. But Pixar realized that would be too dark. Instead, they made Bong tragic in a different way. Not angry or bitter, but heartbreakingly selfless. He's been forgotten, yes, but he still loves Riley and wants what's best for her. His sacrifice in the memory dump is one of the most devastating moments in Pixar's history precisely because he's so purely good. If Bong had been antagonistic or bitter, that moment wouldn't have worked. We needed to love him, to want him to survive, to feel the loss of childhood innocence that his death represents. EVE, the military robot. Back to Wall-E for a moment, because EVE almost had a completely different backstory and purpose. In early concept work, EVE wasn't a probe droid looking for plant life. She was a military robot sent to Earth to neutralize remaining threats. Think of her as a killer robot, designed for combat, not exploration. In this version, Wall-E would have had to convince EVE not to fulfill her destructive programming. The love story would have been about a gentle, romantic robot humanizing a weapon of war. It's an interesting concept, but it would have made the film much darker and more action-oriented. The decision to make EVE a probe looking for life rather than a weapon was crucial. It gave her a purpose that was hopeful rather than destructive. It made her relationship with Wall-E more balanced. Two robots with different functions learning from each other, rather than one robot saving another from her nature. Plus, EVE's directive to find plant life gave the film its central symbol of hope. The plant becomes the most important object in the movie, the sign that Earth can be reborn. If EVE had been a military robot, the entire environmental message of the film would have been lost. Charles Muntz, from comic relief to villain. Here's one you might not know. Charles Muntz, the villain from Up, was originally going to be a comic relief character. In early drafts, Muntz wasn't obsessed with capturing Kevin the bird. Instead, he was going to be a friendly but bumbling explorer who helped Carl and Russell on their adventure. He would have been more of a mentor figure, teaching them about adventure and discovery. But the story wasn't working. Without a real antagonist, Up lacked dramatic tension. The film was too meandering, too episodic. So they made a bold choice: turn the hero into the villain. By making Muntz obsessed with capturing Kevin, he became a dark mirror of Carl's own obsessive behavior. Both men were clinging to the past, unable to move forward. But while Carl learns to let go and embrace new relationships, Muntz never does. His obsession literally kills him. This change gave Up its thematic weight. It wasn't just a story about an old man going on an adventure. It was a story about the dangers of living in the past and the importance of choosing people over dreams. If Muntz had remained a friendly helper, Up would have been a lighter, simpler film, but it wouldn't have had the emotional and thematic depth that made it one of Pixar's best. The characters we almost got. Every single one of these changes would have made these films worse. Some of them would have made them unwatchable. And it makes you wonder, the magic of Pixar isn't just in their animation technology or their clever stories. It's in their willingness to throw out work that isn't working, to completely reimagine characters even late in production, and to trust their instincts about what makes characters emotionally resonant. These characters work because Pixar was willing to keep searching for the right version, even when it meant starting over from scratch. They understood something fundamental about storytelling. Character is everything. So the next time you watch a Pixar film and feel that emotional connection, Remember that these characters almost didn't exist in the forms we love. What do you think? Are there any character changes I missed? What other Pixar characters do you think went through major transformations? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, the best creative decisions often involve figuring out what not to do. Sometimes you have to make the wrong version of a character before you can find the right one. Thanks for watching and keep creating.